This is Land of Havilah, 1 Chronicles 14. Almost everything in this chapter can also be found in 2 Samuel 5. After David established himself in Jerusalem, verse 1, Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David with cedar trees, masons, and carpenters to build him a house. David perceived that Yahweh had established him king over Israel, for his kingdom was exalted on high for his people Israel's sake. David took more wives at Jerusalem, and David became the father of more sons and daughters. These are the names of the children whom he had in Jerusalem: Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Elpalet, Noga, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Beeliada, and Eliphalet. Comment: mostly that falls under the category of David's personal life. In verse 1, King Hiram of Tyre built a house for David in Jerusalem. Hiram's kingdom of Tyre was on the Mediterranean seacoast just north of David's territory. Hiram provided the skilled labor and cedar for the house. No doubt Hiram had self-preservation in mind, building a house for David, because it was already said David was growing stronger and stronger, and naturally Hiram didn't want David to attack, but it went beyond self-preservation. Years later it was said of Hiram, quote, Hiram had always loved David, 1 Kings 5:1. David eventually bulldozed the kingdoms north of him all the way to the Euphrates River, 2 Samuel 8, but he never touched Hiram. The thought never entered his mind as far as we know. Hiram maintained the same good relationship with David's son Solomon, 1 Kings 5. In verse 2, David's philosophy of government was that he was king for the sake of Israel, put there by Yahweh. Therefore, David put Israel above himself, as when he was constantly risking his life on the battlefield, 2 Samuel 21:17. David's older sons were born in Hebron. His younger sons, born in Jerusalem, are listed in verses 4 through 7, and he had many other sons by his concubines, 1 Chronicles 3:9. Coming up after David conquered Jerusalem, his next challenge was to secure Israel from chronic Philistine incursion, verse 8. When the Philistines heard that David was anointed king over all Israel, all the Philistines went up to seek David, and David heard of it and went out against them. Now the Philistines had come and made a raid in the valley of Rephaim. David inquired of God, saying, Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hand? Yahweh said to him, Go up, for I will deliver them into your hand. So they came up to Baal-perazim, and David defeated them there. David said, God's broken my enemies by my hand like waters breaking out. Therefore they called the name of that place Baal-perazim. They left their gods there, and David gave a command, and they were burned with fire. Comment: in verse 8, when David was made king over all Israel, it put a target on his back. The Philistines smelled opportunity to kill him, just as they had killed Saul. As examples of the Philistine incursions into Israel at this time, they had taken over the Jezreel Valley, 1 Samuel 31:7, which was prime, flat, fertile agricultural land, and they had a garrison in Bethlehem, at least at the time David was on the run from Saul, 2 Samuel 23:14. But it's possible David could have taken care of that by now when he was king of Judah. Anyway, the Philistines came to attack him in verse 8. In verse 10, David didn't presume what his strategy should be. He had the option of staying in the fortress at Mount Zion and defending himself from there, or he could leave the fortress and go on the offense. He asked Yahweh about it. Yahweh said, Go up, I'll deliver them into your hand. In verses 10 and 11, on Yahweh's instructions, David went on the attack. Yahweh broke out against the Philistines like a dam breaking open and washing the Philistines away. The place was thereafter called Baal-perazim, which means Lord of the Outbursts. Yahweh burst out against them, and since it was outbursts plural, David expected that Yahweh was capable of it many more times. In verse 12, the Philistines ran. They didn't take time to collect their idols, and Israel burned them. Coming up, the Philistines will make another raid into the same valley of Rephaim near Jerusalem. It could also be translated that the Philistines stripped the valley, meaning they were robbing the Israelites bare. Verse 13. The Philistines made another raid in the valley. David inquired again of God, and God said to him, You shall not go up after them. Turn away from them and come on them opposite the mulberry trees, When you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees, then go out to battle, for God has gone out before you to strike the army of the Philistines." David did as God commanded him, and they attacked the army of the Philistines from Gibeon even to Gezer. The fame of David went out into all lands, and Yahweh brought the fear of him on all nations. Comment in verse 14, David inquired of Yahweh again. That's why we love him. Yahweh told him not to attack the Philistines head on this time, but to circle around behind them, hide in a certain forest of trees or bushes, and wait for his signal to attack. Verse 15 illustrates why Yahweh is called Yahweh of armies. He has a heavenly army that can do damage on earth. The sound of Yahweh's army marching in the tops of the trees was the signal to attack. So the attack came by both men and angels. In verse 15, guess whether it was men or angels who did the most damage. The sound of the marching meant that, quote, God has gone out before you to strike the army of the Philistines, end quote. In verse 17, David went out into all lands, meaning he expanded his kingdom all around. When David took the throne, Israel was the tail, but Yahweh made them the head. This is what Yahweh promised Israel in the days of Moses. Quote, Yahweh will make you the head and not the tail. Deuteronomy 28:13. 1 Chronicles 15 is next.